Senator Ludlam, I understand you want to speak for 20 minutes. You need to seek leave.
I will seek leave to do so, Madam Chair.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise to acknowledge that on Sunday we passed an important anniversary, that the 10th anniversary of the horrific attacks on New York City and of the airlines that were flown into the Twin Towers, into the Pentagon, and one that crashed on its way to its intended target, and that we pause to reflect on the extraordinary violence unleashed on the people of the United States and citizens of countries all around the world in those attacks. I also want to acknowledge that the 11th of September of this year was the 6-month anniversary of the disaster on the Pacific coast of Japan, in which one of the most powerful earthquakes in the country's history, followed by a 15-metre tsunami, smashed into the northeast coast of Japan with horrific loss of life and wrecked the nuclear power complex at Fukashima Daiichi, and that this is an appropriate time to pause and remember the extraordinary loss of life and the ongoing disaster that has been caused there. I had the enormous good fortune to spend Sunday, September the 11th, before I departed for Canberra, at 7 Mile Camp on the outskirts of Alice Springs at the meeting of the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, ANFA, and such an appropriate place and such wonderful company in which to spend that anniversary and consider the violence unleashed in those two events. Spending company in people like Uncle Kevin Buzzacott, who's spent the latter part of his life fighting nuclear dispossession of the land of his people from the impact of the Roxby Downs uranium mine, the Olympic Dam uranium mine in central South Australia. Spending it in the company of Mitch, whose sense of humour and fierce wit and passion for her people leaves an indelible trace, I think, on the memories of anybody who spends time with her. The indestructible Barb Shaw, who has spent far too much of her time, unfortunately, having to fight the negative impacts of the Northern Territory intervention that was so unwisely carried forward by this government. By Auntie Isabel and Bunny Naparula, who travelled down from Tennant Creek to speak to that group of people about the Commonwealth Government, this government's shameful proposal to continue the Howard government's radioactive dispossession of their people with the proposed imposition of a radioactive waste dump to collect together the Commonwealth-obligated nuclear material that principally resides at the moment at Lucas Heights in central South Australia, and a certain amount at overseas reprocessing sites in France. They don't want that material there. They've led an extraordinary campaign, which I've been privileged to be a part of, to prevent that material being dumped in a shed on a cattle station on their traditional lands, so that the Commonwealth Government can wash its hands and walk away. ANFA's been going since 1997. It was formed in Alice Springs in response to the Howard government's unleashing of the uranium sector to vastly more disappointing results than I would imagine they were anticipating, and in particular to respond to the challenge of the proposed Jabiluka mine in Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory. And ANFA stayed strong since then. It was formed as the Alliance Against Uranium. It stayed very strong since then. An amazing gathering of people who you might consider some of the most marginalised and disadvantaged people in the country, Aboriginal communities and activists, elders, and some of the new leaders coming through, gathering once a year. It's the fourth one that I've had the extreme good fortune to attend, to share their stories of dispossession, to share the stories of the campaigns that they've waged and in many cases won against foreign and domestic uranium mining companies and against the activities, the extraordinarily misguided ambitions of successive Commonwealth governments in seeking to leave this toxic time capsule of radioactive waste on their country. We were very fortunate to host a couple of guests from overseas, people with quite intimate experiences of the nuclear industry, of uranium mining. In the case of Eamon Russell, who's a representative of the Navajo Nation, in the United States who've had intimate experience with uranium mining. The Navajo Nation encompasses some parts of Arizona, New Mexico and Utah, and their area was a key target for uranium mining in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. There were more than 1,000 uranium mines on the Navajo lands alone. They suffered the immediate impacts of unventilated mines of no occupational health, safety efforts whatsoever. And in fact, in 1962, the first publication of a statistical correlation between cancer and uranium mining was published by the US Public Health Service as a result of the enormous impacts on the Navajo people, particularly the miners and their families who were mining that material so that the United States government could produce the nuclear weapons that fueled their side of the Cold War. As of 2009, the federal government in the United States has funded more than nearly 22,000 people, a sum of about just under $1.5 billion in reparations for the colossal harm that was caused. I don't know how you compensate people for the loss of life, for families, for the children born sick or deformed, and for the lives cut short. But nonetheless, the US government has been writing out cheques to the tune of $1.4 billion for that damage caused. And in 2008, a 5-year clean-up plan of the Navajo lands was proposed and implemented by the US EPA that estimated that 30% of all Navajo still lack uncontaminated drinking water. It's an experience that is familiar to Aboriginal people here in Australia, and Ammon's words were keenly listened to by the people sitting around the campfire and around the circle at 7 Mile, because the experience here, while different in some important respects, still has huge resonance with what the Navajo suffered. The forced dispossession, the lies of the government who said this activity was safe, the promise of jobs that either never eventuated or turned out to be lethal when they arrived, and then the walking away and the wiping of the hands and the erasing of the history of the dispossession of these people seemed very similar. And again, being able to spend time in the company of Aboriginal people here in Australia who've given up their lives to fight the impacts of the industry here by household names: BHP Billiton, Rio Tinto, Cameco, Mitsubishi's attempts to establish mines in Western Australia. These are companies that many Australians have shares in, that many of us probably invest in indirectly through our superannuation. And they have an extraordinarily dark story to tell, and it's important that it is told. Another guest who we were very fortunate to host at 7 Mile, André Larivière of the French Network to Phase Out the Nuclear Industry, a network of 900 groups in France. We tend to think of the French as being the happy atomic country, as André puts it, the nation of the happy atom. And it's not the case. It hasn't been the case for a long period of time. A recent poll, I'm quoting from a Reuters article of April in this year, of a poll carried out in late March subsequent to the earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan, found that 57% of respondents were generally in favour of dropping nuclear energy, with 20% strongly in favour of the idea. And so the footprint of the nuclear industry in France has taken on this profoundly anti-democratic side, in that most of us here in Australia probably think the French are pretty happy with their clean, green nuclear industry generating 70 or 80% of their electricity. And it is absolutely not the case. The French government will ignore that poll, as polls here in Australia around nuclear power, around uranium mining, have been ignored because it's inconvenient. But the French, who have just suffered another accident, a blast at a reprocessing facility in the south of France that's killed one worker and put a number of others in hospital. There doesn't appear to have been a significant radioactive release, although you always have to take government officials' proclamations with a grain of salt. Nonetheless, an explosion at a reprocessing plant dealing with plutonium, dealing with some of the material that has now showered the northeast part of Japan, is still a cause for serious concern. And I suspect it won't improve the polling numbers the next time a poll is taken in France. The French, of course, are absolutely not alone in opposing nuclear power by various margins. In Japan, 82% of Japanese favoured building more plants in Japan or maintaining existing ones. That was a poll that was taken in 2005. Subsequent to the Fukushima disaster, somewhere between 41 and 54% of the Japanese people now support scrapping or reducing the numbers of nuclear power plants. The outgoing Prime Minister Khan said he would abolish nuclear energy in Japan, that they would phase it out. That's a commitment that has been somewhat weakly endorsed by the incoming Prime Minister, Mr. Noda. It'll be very interesting to see how the democratic aspirations of the people of Japan now play out in the light of the permanent radioactive nightmare that has been unleashed in the Tohoku region of Japan. And so if we take a very quick trip around the world, a Washington Post ABC poll in April 2011 found that 64% of Americans opposed the construction of new reactors. So no surprises why the industry is at an absolute standstill there. Support for nuclear power was similar or much lower in countries as varied as Chile, 12% support, Thailand, 16.5%, Australia, 34%, and the United Kingdom, 35% support. And that, I think, is a problem that has dogged the nuclear industry right from the beginning. But to read some of the things they say, you would think perhaps they have an image problem. And what I would like to say to the Australian Uranium Association, to the World Nuclear Association, and to people active in the uranium industry who think that you will simply be able to sail on through this disaster, that the fundamentals of the industry are strong, as we often hear. My message to you is that you don't have an image problem. You don't have a messaging problem. You have a reality problem. You have a leukemia problem. You have a lung cancer problem. It's not something that is going to be fixed with another glossy fact sheet. People don't like this industry, not because they misunderstand it, but because they understand it perfectly well. That, I think, is going to be very difficult to fix with little video clips on websites and new fact sheets. To quote some of the main spokespeople for the industry in the aftermath of the disaster in Fukushima, and some of the language certainly changed once it became apparent just how seriously it was, range from a sideshow. Mr. John Borshoff from Paladin Energy, who's never short of a few things to say about the nuclear industry, called it a sideshow. Later he said that it was a kick in the teeth for the industry, but that the impact on the industry will be minimal. It'll make the technology even safer than its enviable record. Even our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, what is happening in Japan doesn't have any impact on my thinking about uranium exports. We will continue to export uranium. How bad does it need to get to shake this extraordinary faith? Mr. Ian Hore-Lacey, formerly of the Uranium Institute here in Australia, who now works for the World Nuclear Association, the WNA, she says that the epic accident, this is in a piece that he put up on the 13th of April, the epic accident is certainly a scar on the public perception of nuclear power, especially in the short term. A scar on the public perception, as though we're just seeing it wrong. The industry has some kind of image problem, and that all it needs to do is fix up people's perception of it and everything will be okay. Shows, I think, the magnitude, I guess, of the disconnect, the dissonance that exists in the minds of the strongest advocates of the industry, that all they need to do somehow is fix up the image of the industry and everything's going to be fine. I think we'll be hearing a lot more of that on the part of the nuclear industry and on its supporters in government. The Australian Uranium Association says more facts and better public education will help address nuclear fears that Fukushima has helped fan, as though that accident has somehow caused unnecessary alarm, some kind of radiation phobia. Mr. Zygmunt Switkowski, even though he's been let off the hook and he's no longer directly undermining Australian government policy while on the payroll. At least we're no longer paying him to undermine the Australian government's policy, which I think may still be bipartisan policy, that we shouldn't have nuclear reactors in Australia, is still at it, still spruiking nuclear power, saying that with appropriate safeguards it should be considered a viable source of greenhouse-friendly baseload power for energy-hungry economies. There's all the myths there condensed and rolled into one little sentence. That's handy. The markets, on the other hand, are taking a different tack, and that I think is very interesting, that although people deeply embedded in the industry, there's probably no disaster severe enough to shake their faith. If the spectre of the fallout sprayed across Western Europe and right across the Northern Hemisphere in 1986 from Chernobyl didn't shake the faith, the depopulation of part of Tohoku Prefecture with permanent radioactive contamination, if that didn't shake the faith, perhaps the faith of investors will be shaken by, firstly, the demolition of TEPCO's balance sheet, but also the fact that the world uranium price has crashed from its peaks in 2007. At Fukushima, say UBS, in an April summary, at Fukushima 4 reactors have been out of control for weeks. We'll now call that 6 months. Casting doubt on whether even an advanced economy can master nuclear safety, we believe the Fukushima accident was the most serious ever for the credibility of nuclear power, and the market, of course, is bearing that out. The uranium spot price on the 6th of September was back down to $48.85 a pound US, so prices have dropped by about a third. The Merrill Lynch Uranium Equity Index was down 19% over the past month. This is well after the Fukushima disaster, and people have been given time to absorb the sheer magnitude of that disaster. Shares in ERA, one of Australia's most prominent uranium miners at Kakadu and Ranger, are down 13% in the last month and 73% in the last year. So even though Mr. Martin Ferguson, from the confines of his safe office way down in Melbourne, a long way from the impact areas of these mines, may think this is a fantastic idea, investors are deserting the sector. The company has posted a $122 million half-year net loss. This is a big uranium miner backed by Rio Tinto with deep pockets, and they are taking an absolute bath. Cameco, Denison Mines, Paladin in particular, one of my favourites, they are all suffering by investors simply withdrawing funds from this industry. This week we learned that big European companies want to sell their stakes in Urenco, and the British government is also said to be thinking about selling its shares. The industry internationally has gone into something of a free fall. The World Nuclear Industry Status Report, which I can strongly commend, as a fairly clear-eyed examination of who's building what around the world and who is closing what, shows that 438 reactors were operating this May in 30 countries, which is 6 fewer than the maximum of 444 in 2002. 14 countries are building nuclear power plants, but most of the sites are accumulating substantial and costly delays. Only 3/4 of those reactors are being built in 4 countries only, and none of those countries has a history of transparency or reliable information about the status of their construction work. The industry tends to think that China will save their fortunes, and China, in fact, gives us, or gives me personally, the greatest cause for concern. WikiLeaks cables released in UK newspapers now show that a Swedish political group reveals that US analysts are worried about the safety of Chinese new reactors. There's no independent regulatory authority there. There's no independent press. Activists or people like me who might raise their concerns in public forums end up carted away to re-education through labour camps, as Sun Xiaodi and his daughter were. And so I think the industry has a very serious problem. The problem being that the disaster at Fukushima is vastly worse than we're being told. Parents in Fukushima City, a city of 300,000 people 60 kilometres from the plant, have banded together to demand that the government do more to protect around 100,000 children who are living in areas that would have been evacuated if they'd been within the impact area of Chernobyl. The doses that were suffered in the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl reactor, the Japanese government has been extraordinarily slow to respond. They've been very tight-fisted with information, and that has cost a great deal of harm and unnecessary alarm. And now it is unclear actually as to when those reactors will be brought back under control. The impact's so much closer to home. as I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, that sovereignty is denied and the radioactive contamination is the same. So to the industry, we realise that you are not for compromise, and so of course neither will we. We are in this to close you down, and that I certainly won't rest until that has been achieved.
Time's expired.